Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the profound journey of a faithful servant who walked through the deepest valleys of suffering, a narrative inspired by the book of Job, one of the most ancient and mysterious texts in all of Scripture. This story explores the nature of faith when everything is stripped away and teaches us about the mystery of divine purpose, the value of honest questioning, and the ultimate restoration that comes through unwavering trust in God's wisdom. As you listen, allow these faith-filled words to envelop you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through Scripture-inspired narratives. Now, take a deep breath, settle into the presence of God, and let us begin tonight's journey through this blessed story. In the land of Uz, where the desert winds carried whispers of ancient songs and the hills rolled like waves frozen in time, there lived a man whose name meant persecuted or perhaps returning. Though in those days, before the great trial, no one could have imagined how perfectly his name would describe his journey. His name was Jobab, a humble shepherd who tended his father's flocks in the shadow of those timeless hills. The dawn broke slowly over Uz, as it always did, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to promise nothing but goodness. Jobab stood at the entrance of his modest stone dwelling, breathing in the cool morning air that carried the scent of wild herbs and the distant bleating of sheep stirring from their rest. He was neither young nor old, his face marked by years of honest labor under the sun, his hands calloused but gentle, his eyes holding that particular clarity that comes to those who spend their days in quiet contemplation beneath endless skies. His small household was beginning to wake. Inside, his wife Keturah moved about, preparing the morning meal: barley bread and goat cheese, dates preserved from the last harvest, fresh water drawn from the well before sunrise. Their 3 children still slept on their woven mats, peaceful in the innocence of youth, unaware of how precious these ordinary mornings were, how each peaceful dawn was a gift that could be neither bought nor guaranteed. Jobab had learned this truth early, though he had not yet experienced its deepest meaning. His father had taught him the prayers of their people, the ancient words that connected them to the God of their fathers, the one who had made covenant with Abraham, who had delivered the people from Egypt, who watched over the faithful with eyes that neither slumbered nor slept. Every morning, Jobab would stand facing east and offer his prayers, his voice joining the eternal conversation between heaven and earth. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe," he would begin, the familiar words flowing like water from a spring, "who has given us life, sustained us, and brought us to this season." It was not mere ritual for Jobab. Each word carried the weight of genuine gratitude, for he understood that every breath was a gift, every dawn a mercy, every moment with his family a treasure beyond measure. The sheep were his responsibility, inherited from his father as his father had inherited them from the generations before. They were not a large flock, perhaps 200 animals, but they were healthy and well tended. Jobab knew each one, could identify them by their markings and their temperament. There was the old ewe with the torn ear who had survived a wolf attack years ago, limping but stubborn. There was the ram with the crooked horn who led the others to the best grazing. There were the spring lambs, still unsteady on their legs, staying close to their mothers. His days followed the rhythm that shepherds had known since the beginning of time. He would lead the flock to pasture, find them water, protect them from predators, guide them back to the fold as evening fell. In the heat of the day, while the sheep rested in whatever shade could be found, Jobab would sit with his staff across his knees and ponder the mysteries of existence. Why did some men prosper while others suffered? Why did rain fall on one field and not another? What was the purpose of a human life, brief as grass, fading as a flower? These were not bitter questions for Jobab, but genuine wonderings. He had seen enough of life to know that it contained both joy and sorrow, that the same sun that warmed the earth could also scorch it, that the same rain that brought life could also bring flood. Yet through it all, he had maintained his faith in the goodness of the one who created all things, trusting that there was a purpose and a pattern beyond human understanding. In the evenings, after the sheep were safely penned and the day's work was done, Jobab would sit with his family around the small fire. Keturah would serve the evening meal, and they would eat together, speaking of the day's events, small things, ordinary things, the fabric of a life woven thread by thread. His eldest son would speak of his apprenticeship with the village potter, learning to shape clay into useful vessels. His daughter would share the song she had learned from her mother, her voice sweet in the gathering darkness. His youngest, barely past infancy, would fall asleep in his arms, trusting and secure. These were the moments Jobab treasured most. Not wealth or fame or power, but this, the warmth of the fire, the faces of those he loved, the simple peace of knowing that all was well with his household. He was not rich by the standards of great men. He had no vast estates, no armies of servants, no chests filled with gold. But he had enough, and he had learned that enough was a feast. The village of Uz was small, perhaps 20 families in all, scattered across the hillsides. They shared wells and pastures, helped each other in times of need, gathered for festivals and celebrations. Jobab was respected among them, known for his integrity and his wisdom in settling disputes. When neighbors quarreled over boundary stones or wayward animals, they would come to him, and he would listen carefully to both sides before offering his judgment, always seeking not just justice, but reconciliation. A gentle answer turns away wrath, he would say, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Let us seek peace between brothers, for what profit is there in strife? And usually, through his patient mediation, peace would be restored, and the community would remain whole. There was one practice that set Jobab apart, however, that marked him as a man of unusual devotion. Every 7 days, at the end of each week, he would rise before dawn and make burnt offerings for his children. He would take young lambs from his flock, the best and healthiest, and sacrifice them at the stone altar his grandfather had built on the high place overlooking the valley. As the smoke rose toward heaven, he would pray for his children, asking God to forgive any sins they might have committed, any ways they might have strayed from righteousness, even in their hearts. Perhaps my children have sinned, he would say, and cursed God in their hearts. Therefore, I make atonement for them, that they might stand blameless before the Almighty. It was not that his children were particularly wayward. Indeed, they were good and obedient. But Jobab understood something profound about the nature of the human heart, how easily it could turn away. how naturally pride and selfishness grew like weeds in even the best tended garden. He wanted to stand between his children and judgment, to cover them with sacrifice, to ensure that they remained in right relationship with the Holy One. This was Jobab's life, and it was good. Simple, perhaps, by some standards, but rich in the things that truly mattered. He went to sleep each night with a clear conscience and woke each morning with a grateful heart. The seasons turned, the flocks increased, his children grew, and all was well. But in the unseen realms, beyond the veil that separates heaven from earth, beyond the comprehension of mortal minds, there were conversations taking place that would change everything. There were councils being held, questions being raised, challenges being issued that would test the very foundations of Jobab's faith and understanding. On one particular day, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, there came also among them the adversary, the one who walks to and fro upon the earth, seeking whom he may accuse. And the Lord said to this adversary, "From where do you come?" And the adversary answered, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." Then the Lord said, "Have you considered my servant Jobab? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil." But the adversary answered with a voice like silk over steel, "Does Jobab fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to the adversary, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." This conversation, this cosmic wager, this testing of the foundations, none of this was known to Jobab as he went about his day. He led his sheep to pasture as usual, guided them to the stream where they could drink, found them shade when the sun grew hot. He sat on a rock and watched them graze, his thoughts turning, as they often did, to the great mysteries. What did God require of a man? How should one live in this brief span of years granted to mortals? What was the right path through a world that contained both beauty and danger, both blessing and trial? He did not know that the answers to these questions were about to be written in the pages of his own life, inscribed in suffering and loss that would strip away everything he thought he understood, leaving only the naked core of faith to face the storm. The day seemed ordinary enough. The sun traced its familiar arc across the sky. The sheep moved lazily from patch to patch of grass. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermal currents. Small lizards darted among the rocks. Everything was as it had always been, the world turning in its ancient rhythms, reliable and sure. But as afternoon began to stretch toward evening, Jobab noticed something unusual. A figure was running toward him across the hills, moving with the desperate speed of someone bearing urgent news. As the figure drew closer, Jobab recognized him, one of the young men from the village, the son of his neighbor, Bildad. The young man's face was twisted with distress, his clothes torn, dirt smudging his cheeks where tears had fallen. Jobab stood, his heart beginning to quicken with a nameless dread. He knew, even before the young man spoke, that something terrible had happened. There was a quality to this moment, a weight in the air, that told him his life was about to change forever. The young man collapsed at Jobab's feet, gasping for breath. "Master," he managed to say, "disaster has struck. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and raiders from the desert fell upon them. They took the animals and killed the servants. I alone have escaped to tell you." Before Jobab could even process this news, before the shock could fully register, another messenger appeared, running from a different direction. This one was covered in soot and ash, his eyes wide with horror. "Fire has fallen from heaven," he cried, "and burned up the sheep and the servants who were tending them. The flames consumed everything. I alone have escaped to tell you." Jobab felt the world beginning to tilt beneath his feet, but still he stood, his shepherd's staff gripped tight in his hand. 2 messages of disaster in as many minutes. Half his livestock gone. His servants, men he had known for years, who had eaten at his table, whose families he had provided for, dead. How could this be happening? Why? But there was no time for questions. A third messenger was approaching, this one limping, blood staining his garments. "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands," he reported, his voice breaking, "and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." 3 disasters, 3 messengers, 3 reports of death and loss. Jobab's mind struggled to comprehend it. In the space of minutes, his entire livelihood had been destroyed. The flocks that represented years of careful stewardship, generations of family heritage, gone. The servants who had been like extended family, killed. Everything he had worked for, everything he had been responsible for, wiped away, as if it had never existed. He wanted to sit down, to close his eyes, to wake from this nightmare. But even as these thoughts formed, he saw a 4th figure approaching, and this one he recognized immediately. His oldest son's best friend, a young man who often spent time at Jobab's house, who was like another son to him. The young man's face was ashen, his movements unsteady, as if he had been struck a physical blow. Jobab's blood turned to ice. "No," he thought, "please, not that. Anything but that." The young man fell to his knees before Jobab. His mouth opened and closed several times before words would come. When they finally did, they fell like stones into a deep well, each one echoing in the sudden terrible silence that had descended upon the hillside. "Your sons and daughters," he whispered, "were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. A great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell upon the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." The world stopped. Time itself seemed to freeze, the sun halting in its descent, the wind ceasing its eternal movement. Jobab stood absolutely still, the words hanging in the air before him like physical things, refusing to be absorbed, refusing to be real. His children, all of them, his sons, his daughter, the ones he had prayed for every week, offering sacrifices for their protection, interceding for their souls. The ones who had slept peacefully that very morning on their mats, innocent and beloved. The ones who represented his future, his legacy, his heart, walking around outside his body. Gone, all of them, in an instant, without warning, without chance for goodbye or last words or final embraces. The staff fell from Jobab's hand. His legs gave way, and he sank to the ground. Around him, the sheep continued grazing, unaware that their shepherd's world had just ended. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, indifferent to human suffering. The earth turned on its axis, following the laws laid down at creation, caring nothing for one man's agony. For a long time, minutes or hours Jobab could not have said, he simply knelt there on the rocky ground, unable to move, unable to think, unable to feel anything but a vast echoing emptiness where his heart had been. This could not be real. It could not be happening. Just this morning, everything had been fine. His children had been alive. His flocks had been safe. His life had been secure. How could it all be gone? How could everything be taken in the span of a single afternoon? The questions swirled in his mind like leaves in a whirlwind, but no answers came. There was only the terrible silence, the unbearable absence, the crushing weight of a loss too great to be comprehended. And then, slowly, moving as if through deep water, Jobab reached up and took hold of his robe. With a deliberate motion, he tore it from neck to hem, the sound of rending fabric loud in the quiet hillside. He removed his head covering and let it fall to the ground. Then, with his own hands, he began to shave his head, traditional sign of deep mourning, the physical expression of an inner devastation beyond words. When this was done, when these rituals of grief had been completed, Jobab did something that would echo through all the ages to come. He did not curse. He did not rage against heaven. He did not declare that God was cruel or unjust or absent. Instead, moving carefully, his body heavy with sorrow, he lowered himself until his face touched the earth, and there, prostrate in the dust from which he had been formed, to which he would one day return, he spoke words that came from somewhere deeper than his conscious mind, welling up from a spring of faith that even this catastrophe could not completely destroy. "Naked I came from my mother's womb," he said, his voice barely audible, muffled by the earth against which his face was pressed, "and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." The words hung in the air, seemingly impossible words given the circumstances. How could he bless the name of God when God had permitted this? How could he acknowledge God's sovereignty when that sovereignty had allowed his children to be crushed? How could he maintain faith when faith had not protected the innocent? Yet these were the words he spoke, and in speaking them, he demonstrated something profound about the nature of true faith, that it exists not because of blessings received, but in spite of blessings removed, that it stands firm, not when everything makes sense, but precisely when nothing makes sense, that it trusts not in explanations, but in the character of the one who is beyond all explaining. The messengers stood at a distance watching their master's grief, their own hearts broken for him. They had expected cursing, had braced themselves for rage or despair or collapse, but this terrible dignity, this impossible faith, left them silent with wonder and sorrow. As the sun finally slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson that seemed appropriate for such a day of bloodshed and loss, Jobab slowly rose to his feet. His movements were those of an old man, though he had awakened that morning in the full strength of his years. His face was streaked with dust and tears, his robe torn, his head bare to the gathering night. He looked down at the sheep he had been tending, these animals who had no knowledge of tragedy, no comprehension of loss. They needed to be taken home, needed to be penned for the night. Life, even in the midst of death, made its demands. Duty, even in the midst of devastation, still called. So Jobab gathered his flock and began the slow walk back to the village, back to the house where he would have to tell Keturah, back to the rooms that would echo with absence, back to a life that had been completely and irrevocably shattered. The sheep walked ahead of him, their bleating the only sound in the deepening darkness, and Jobab followed, placing one foot in front of the other, because that was what one did. One continued, one endured, one lived, even when living seemed impossible. When he reached his home, Keturah was waiting at the door. She had already heard the news. In a small village, tragedy travels faster than light. She stood there, her own face marked by grief, her hands clutching the doorframe as if to keep herself upright, When she saw him, she made a sound that was not quite a word, not quite a cry, something more primal than either. They came together in the doorway, two people who had lost everything that mattered most, holding each other as the full weight of their shared grief crashed over them like a wave. Inside the house, the children's mats still lay where they had slept that morning. Their belongings, a wooden toy, a hair comb, a pair of sandals, sat in their usual places, innocent objects now transformed into unbearable reminders. The house that had been filled with life and laughter was now a tomb, and Jobab and Keturah were its only inhabitants, ghosts in their own home. That night was the longest of Jobab's life. He did not sleep. How could he sleep when every time he closed his eyes he saw his children's faces? He sat in the darkness, Keturah beside him, and they wept together, mourned together, suffered together the particular agony known only to parents who have lost their children. There are no words adequate to such grief. Language itself breaks down, unable to contain or express the magnitude of the loss. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of anguish. Neighbors came to offer condolences, bringing food that Jobab and Keturah could not eat, speaking words of comfort that could not comfort. The community held a memorial service, but there were no bodies to bury. They had already been interred in haste, as custom demanded in that hot climate. Jobab went through the motions of mourning, fulfilled the expected rituals, but inside he felt hollow, emptied out, a vessel broken beyond repair. Through it all, he maintained his faith, but it was no longer the simple, joyful faith of before. Now it was something harder, more tested, faith that existed alongside questions that would not be silenced. Why had this happened? What purpose could such suffering serve? If God was just and good, how could he allow the innocent to perish? If God was all-powerful, why had he not protected Jobab's children? These questions tormented him, but still he did not curse God. Still he maintained that God was sovereign, that somehow, in ways beyond human understanding, this catastrophe fit into a larger pattern, served a greater purpose. But oh, how heavy that faith had become, how exhausting to maintain, how much strength it required simply to continue believing when everything in his experience seemed to contradict the goodness of God. And then, just when he thought the worst had passed, just when he had begun to imagine how he might eventually learn to live with this grief, the second wave struck. He woke one morning feeling unwell. His skin itched terribly, and when he scratched, he found raised sores beginning to form. By midday, the sores had spread across his entire body, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. They oozed and burned, making every movement agony. His skin felt as if it were on fire, each breath painful, each heartbeat sending waves of torment through his flesh. Keturah called for the village elders, for anyone who might know how to treat such an affliction, but none had seen anything like it. The sores continued to spread and worsen, and with them came fever and weakness. Jobab's body, which had been strong and healthy just days before, was now a prison of pain. The village council met and reached a terrible decision. This disease, whatever it was, might be contagious. For the safety of the community, Jobab would have to be isolated. He would have to leave his home, leave his wife, leave the village, and take up residence at the ash heap outside the city walls, where refuse was burned and the ritually unclean were forced to dwell. So Jobab, having already lost his children, his livestock, and his health, now lost his place in the community, his dignity, his home. He was led to the ash heap like a leper, given a broken piece of pottery with which to scrape his sores, and left there to suffer alone. He sat in the ashes, covered in festering boils, burning with fever, barely able to move for the pain. All around him lay the refuse of the city, broken pottery, animal bones, ashes from burnt offerings, the detritus of human life. This was where he had been brought. This was what he had become. Refuse himself, discarded, useless, untouchable. The physical suffering was immense, but even worse was the spiritual anguish. Where was God in all this? Why had the Almighty, who could have prevented everything, allowed it to happen? What sin had Jobab committed that deserved such punishment? He had lived righteously, had offered sacrifices, had taught his children the ways of the Lord. He had been blameless and upright, and this was his reward? During the days that followed, Jobab existed in a fog of pain and confusion. Sometimes Keturah would come to the edge of the ash heap, bringing food and water, though Jobab had little appetite for either. She would stand at a distance, as the law required, and they would speak briefly. But what was there to say? What words could bridge the chasm of suffering that separated them? On one of these visits, Keturah's composure finally broke. She stood there looking at her husband, once strong and healthy, now reduced to a mass of sores and sorrow, and her own grief and anger boiled over. "Are you still holding on to your integrity?" she cried, her voice sharp with pain and accusation. "Curse God and die. What is the point of faith if this is where it leads? What good has righteousness done you? You have lost everything, and still you persist in this foolishness, this blind trust in a God who has abandoned you. Let go! Curse him! End this torment!" Jobab looked at his wife, understanding her anguish, knowing that she spoke from a heart as broken as his own. But he could not do what she asked. Even now, even here, covered in sores and sitting in ashes, he could not bring himself to curse the name of God. "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak," he said, his voice rough with fever and sorrow. "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive adversity? If we accept blessing from his hand, can we refuse to accept suffering? If we trust him in prosperity, should we not trust him also in calamity?" Keturah turned away, unable to bear either his suffering or his faith. She left him there, and Jobab was alone again with his questions, his pain, and his stubborn refusal to relinquish his trust in the God who seemed to have forsaken him. News of Jobab's catastrophes and afflictions spread throughout the region. In time, word reached 3 of his friends, men he had known for many years, with whom he had shared bread and wisdom, who respected him and honored his righteousness. Their names were Eliphaz from Teman, a city known for its wise men, Bildad from Shuah, a man learned in the traditions of the ancients, and Zophar from Naamah, known for his zeal and conviction. When these 3 heard of all that had befallen their friend, they made an appointment together to come and console him, to mourn with him, to sit in solidarity with his suffering. They traveled from their distant homes, making the journey out of genuine love and concern, arriving at the ash heap, where Jobab had been exiled. When they first saw him, they almost did not recognize him. The man they remembered, healthy, prosperous, dignified, had been replaced by this creature covered in boils, his skin blackened by disease, his body wasted by pain. The transformation was so complete, so shocking, that they lifted up their voices and wept. They too tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads, traditional signs of mourning, honoring the depth of their friend's suffering. Then, in a gesture of profound respect and solidarity, they sat down with him on the ground, there in the ash heap, and remained silent. For 7 days and 7 nights they sat with Jobab, not speaking, simply being present to his pain. It was the ancient way of mourning, acknowledging that some grief is too deep for words, that sometimes the greatest comfort is simply not being alone. During those 7 days, Jobab's mind turned over and over the questions that tormented him. He reviewed his life, searching for the sin that might have brought such punishment. He examined every action, every thought, every word. Had he cheated in business? No. Had he been unjust to servants? No. Had he turned away the poor? No. Had he trusted in wealth? No. Had he worshipped idols? Never. Had he rejoiced in his enemy's misfortune? No. Had he concealed his transgressions? No. He could find no sin worthy of such judgment. And if there was no proportional sin, then what did that say about justice? What did it say about God? The questions circled endlessly, finding no resolution, offering no peace. On the 8th day, Jobab finally broke the silence. The words that emerged were not curses against God, but something perhaps even more shocking. Curses against his own existence, against the day of his birth, against the fact of his being. He opened his mouth, and anguish poured out like water from a broken cistern. "Let the day perish on which I was born," he cried, "and the night that said, 'A man is conceived.' Let that day be darkness. Let God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it." His voice gained strength as the words continued, each phrase a hammer blow against the reality that had become unbearable. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me? Or why the breasts that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest. This was the voice of a man pushed beyond his limits, someone who had been required to bear more than human strength could support. He was not cursing God. He still would not do that, but he was cursing his own existence, questioning the value of a life that contained such suffering. His 3 friends listened, and as they listened, they began to formulate explanations. Surely, they thought, there must be a reason for such calamity. In their understanding of the world, suffering came as a result of sin, prosperity as a result of righteousness. The equation was simple, clear, just. If Jobab was suffering so terribly, then surely he must have sinned terribly, whether he admitted it or not. Eliphaz spoke first, choosing his words carefully, speaking with the authority of one who considered himself wise in the ways of God. "Remember, who that was innocent ever perished," he said, "or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed." He meant well. He truly believed he was helping his friend understand the nature of divine justice. But his words, however well-intentioned, fell on Jobab like additional blows, adding spiritual torment to physical agony. "Think now," Eliphaz continued, "who that was innocent ever perished. Surely God does not reject a blameless man, nor take the hand of evildoers. He will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouting. But first, you must acknowledge your sin and repent." Jobab listened, and something in him recoiled. His friend was telling him that his children had died because of Jobab's sin, that the suffering of innocents could be explained away as collateral damage in God's punishment of the guilty. That justice was so simple, so mathematical, so clean. But Jobab knew better. He knew his own heart. He knew he was not perfect. No human was perfect. But he also knew he had not committed any sin proportionate to this punishment. And more importantly, he knew that if God was just, then the innocent should not suffer for the guilty's sake. His children had been blameless. They had done nothing to deserve death. How could their destruction be considered justice? "Your words are wind," Jobab responded, his voice weak but firm. "Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Even if I have sinned, how does that explain the death of my children? Were they not innocent? Are you saying that God kills children to punish their father? What kind of justice is that?" But his friends were not deterred. Bildad took up the argument, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and ancient wisdom. "Does God pervert justice?" he asked rhetorically. "Or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the hand of their transgression. But if you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation." Again, the same assumption. Suffering equals guilt. Prosperity equals righteousness. The friends could not conceive of a world where the innocent suffered, where the righteous were afflicted, where God's justice did not operate according to simple human understanding. Day after day, the debate continued. Jobab would speak of his innocence, would describe his righteous life, would question how such calamity could befall someone who had walked uprightly. His friends would respond with increasingly harsh accusations, convinced that Jobab's insistence on his innocence was itself a form of pride and sin. Zophar was perhaps the harshest. "Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves," he declared. "Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? If you prepare your heart, if you stretch out your hands toward him, if iniquity is in your hand, put it far away. Then surely you will lift up your face without blemish, less than his guilt deserved." Jobab had lost his children, his health, his place in society, everything he had worked for, everyone he loved. And this was less than he deserved. What crime could possibly warrant more? The conversations went on for weeks, circling the same territory again and again. The friends offered various theories, each one attempting to explain Jobab's suffering in ways that preserved their understanding of divine justice. Perhaps Jobab had sinned in secret. Perhaps his children had been wicked without his knowledge. Perhaps God was testing him, refining him like silver in fire. Perhaps this was discipline, meant to bring him closer to God. But none of these explanations satisfied Jobab, because he knew the truth they could not accept, that sometimes the innocent do suffer, that sometimes there is no direct relationship between righteousness and prosperity, that sometimes God's ways are so far beyond human comprehension that all our neat theories and tidy explanations collapse into dust. "If only I could find God," Jobab cried out one day, his voice echoing across the ash heap. "If only I could come before his throne and present my case. I would lay out my argument before him. I would find out what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No. Surely he would pay attention to me. There an upright man could argue with him, and I would be acquitted forever by my judge." This was what Jobab longed for more than anything, not restoration of his wealth or health, not even the return of his children, as impossible as that would be. He longed to stand before God and ask, why? Not in anger, but in genuine desire to comprehend, to find meaning in the meaningless, to discover purpose in the purposeless. But God seemed distant, unreachable, hidden behind clouds of silence. Jobab searched the heavens for answers, but the heavens were empty of voice. He cried out in his prayers, but his prayers seemed to rise no higher than the smoke from the ash heap, dissipating into nothingness. "Oh, that I knew where I might find him," Jobab whispered into the night, his voice hoarse from suffering and crying, "that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me." The friends continued their arguments, their voices rising and falling like waves against a shore that refused to be moved. They brought forth example after example, parable after parable, all designed to convince Jobab that he must have sinned, that suffering on this scale could only be divine judgment. But Jobab held fast to his integrity. "I will not deny my righteousness," he declared, though his voice trembled with weakness. "My integrity I hold fast, and I will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days." Yet even as he maintained his innocence, the questions continued to torment him. If he was innocent, then why this suffering? If God was just, then why did the innocent suffer? If God was good, then why did evil prosper? The world seemed turned upside down, all his previous understanding shattered like pottery dropped on stone. The weeks became months. The seasons began to turn. The spring rains came and went, bringing new grass to the hills where Jobab had once shepherded his flocks. Life continued for others. They planted and harvested, married and gave birth, laughed and celebrated, while Jobab sat in his ash heap, forgotten by all but his tormentors, both human and spiritual. His body deteriorated further. The boils festered and spread, covering every inch of his skin. His bones ached with a pain that never ceased. He could not sleep, for the pain was too great. He could not eat, for food had lost all taste, and his throat was raw. His appearance became so terrible that children would run from him in fear, and even the village dogs would not come near. But through it all, through the physical agony and spiritual desolation, through the accusations of friends and the silence of God, Jobab maintained one thing: his refusal to curse God. It would have been so easy. One word of curse, and perhaps the torment would end. One declaration that God was unjust, and perhaps death would come as mercy. But he could not do it. Something deep within him, deeper than reason, deeper than understanding, deeper than even pain, held him fast to faith. Finally, after months of debate, after countless rounds of argument and counter-argument, a fourth voice entered the conversation, a young man named Elihu, who had been listening silently all this time, could contain himself no longer. Elihu was angry at Jobab for justifying himself rather than God, angry at the three friends for condemning Jobab without finding an adequate answer, angry at the whole situation that seemed to mock justice and reason. He was younger than the others, and by custom should have waited for his elders to finish speaking. But he could wait no longer. "I am young in years, and you are aged," he began, his voice tight with controlled passion. "Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, 'Let days speak, and many years teach wisdom.' But it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right." He turned to Jobab, his eyes flashing with intensity. "You say, 'I am in the right, and God has taken away my right. In spite of my right, I am counted a liar. My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. But Jobab, you are not right in this, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend against him, saying, he will answer none of man's words?" Elihu continued, his speech flowing like a river, that had broken through a dam. For God speaks in one way and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men while they slumber on their beds, then he opens the ears of men and terrifies them with warnings, that he may turn man aside from his deed and conceal pride from a man. There was something different about Elihu's words. Where the three friends had accused and condemned, Elihu sought to redirect. He acknowledged that Jobab had not committed the sins the friends suggested, but he also challenged Jobab's questioning of God's justice. His arguments were not about past sin causing present suffering, but about God's sovereignty and the limits of human understanding. Behold, God is exalted in his power, Elihu declared, his voice rising. Who is a teacher like him? Who has prescribed for him his way, or who can say, "You have done wrong"? Remember to extol his work, of which men have sung. All mankind has looked on it. Man beholds it from afar. For days Elihu spoke, his words pouring forth like a thunderstorm, passionate and powerful. He spoke of God's majesty in creation, of his power in the storm, of his wisdom in the ordering of the world. He spoke of how God governs the nations, how he provides food for all creatures, how the lightning and thunder obey his command. "Hear this, Jobab," Elihu said, his voice dropping to intensity rather than volume. "Stop and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know how God lays his command upon them and causes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know the balancings of the clouds, the wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge?" The speech continued, building and building, pointing not to Jobab's sin, but to God's incomprehensible greatness. And then, just as Elihu was reaching his crescendo, just as he was speaking of storms and clouds and God's power in nature, something happened. The air changed, a pressure built, heavy and expectant. The sky, which had been clear, suddenly darkened. Clouds appeared from nowhere, gathering with unnatural speed. The wind began to rise, whipping through the ash heap, stirring the dust into whirlwinds. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer. Elihu's voice faltered. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he looked at the gathering storm. The three friends, who had been listening to the young man's speech, now rose to their feet, their faces turning pale. They knew, somehow, that this was no ordinary storm. The wind grew stronger, howling across the hills, bending the trees nearly double. The clouds became darker, almost black, shot through with veins of lightning. The thunder grew louder and louder until it was a constant roar. And then from the heart of the storm, from the whirlwind itself, a voice spoke. It was not like any human voice. It was deeper, vaster, containing multitudes. It was the voice of mountains forming and seas being born. It was the voice that had spoken at creation, saying, "Let there be light." It was the voice Jobab had longed to hear, had despaired of ever hearing. And now it was here, speaking from the tempest, addressing him directly. "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" the voice demanded, and Jobab felt the words penetrate to his very soul. "Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me." Jobab fell on his face, trembling not with fear exactly, but with awe so profound it bordered on terror. This was what he had asked for, a chance to stand before God, to present his case. But now that the moment had arrived, all his carefully prepared arguments fled like chaff before the wind. In the presence of this voice, what could he possibly say? "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?" the voice continued, and Jobab could only listen, struck speechless by the grandeur of what he was hearing. "Tell me, If you have understanding, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The questions came like waves, each one vast and unanswerable. They were not accusations exactly, but neither were they gentle. They were questions that revealed the enormous gulf between creator and creature, between infinite and finite, between the one who set the stars in their courses and the man who could not even understand his own suffering. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? The voice asked. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? On and on the questions rolled, a torrent of divine rhetoric that left no space for answer. God spoke of the sea and its bounds, of light and darkness and their dwelling places, of snow and hail stored up for the day of trouble. He spoke of the constellations in their courses, of the rain that falls on the wilderness where no man is, of the ice that binds the waters and the frost that transforms the surface of the deep. Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? The voice demanded. Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food? The speech moved from the inanimate creation to the animals, describing each with such intimate knowledge, such obvious care, that Jobab began to understand something he had never grasped before. God's attention was not limited. He cared for the mountain goat giving birth in the lonely cliffs. He had given the wild donkey its freedom and the wild ox its strength. He made the ostrich, strange and foolish, yet swift as the wind. He gave the horse its might and clothed its neck with a mane. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings toward the south? God asked. Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? Each question, each description was a lesson in humility. The world was vast, and Jobab was small. The creation was complex beyond comprehension, and Jobab understood so little. Even the animals, their instincts, their abilities, their freedom, these were gifts from God, demonstrations of divine wisdom and power that operated completely outside human control or understanding. Then the voice paused. The wind continued to howl, the lightning to flash, but there was a moment of silence in which Jobab knew he was expected to respond. What could he say? How could mere words address what he had just heard? Shall a fault-finder contend with the Almighty? The voice asked, not harshly, but with the weight of absolute authority. He who argues with God, let him answer it. Jobab's mouth opened, then closed. His mind, which had been full of arguments and questions, was now empty. All his carefully reasoned protests, all his claims of innocence, all his demands for explanation, they seemed suddenly petty, small, irrelevant in the face of this overwhelming presence. Behold, I am of small account, he finally managed to say, his voice barely audible over the wind. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer, twice, but I will proceed no further. He thought perhaps that would be the end of it. He had been humbled, had acknowledged his smallness. Surely God would now explain, would answer the questions, would make sense of the suffering, but instead the voice spoke again from the whirlwind, and this time there was something almost challenging in its tone. Dress for action like a man, God said again. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? The question struck Jobab like physical blows. That was what he had been doing, wasn't it? in his insistence on his own innocence, in his demands for explanation, hadn't he been implicitly putting God in the wrong? Hadn't he been saying, in effect, I am righteous, and you have treated me unjustly? Have you an arm like God? The voice continued, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. The speech continued, now focusing not on creation, but on God's governance of the moral order. Could Jobab humble the proud? Could he bring down the wicked? Could he execute justice on a cosmic scale? If suffering was to be distributed according to desert, could Jobab do it better? If the world needed governing, could Jobab govern it? Then the voice turned to two creatures, describing them in such vivid, powerful detail that they seemed to come alive before Jobab's imagination. First was Behemoth, a creature of enormous strength and power who ate grass like an ox, yet had bones like tubes of bronze and limbs like bars of iron. This creature represented the raw power of creation, the strength that God could command, but which was entirely beyond human control. Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you, God said. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. Then came Leviathan, even more fearsome, a creature of the deep, scaled and terrible, breathing fire and smoke, impossible to capture or tame. The description went on, painting a picture of a monster so powerful that merely thinking of trying to fight it would be madness. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook? God asked, and there was almost humor in the question. Or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? The absurdity of the questions made the point clear. These creatures, which represented the wild, untamable forces of creation, were completely beyond human power to control. Yet God had made them. God governed them. They served his purposes, whatever those purposes might be. Lay your hands on him, God said of Leviathan. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, the hope of a man is false. He is laid low, even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me? Who has first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. And there it was, the heart of the answer, such as it was. Not an explanation of why Jobab had suffered, not a justification of the specific tragedies that had befallen him, but a declaration of sovereignty so absolute, so comprehensive, that it rendered all human questioning ultimately pointless. God was saying, I made the world. I govern it. The forces I have set in motion are beyond your comprehension, much less your control. You cannot even understand the animals I have made, much less question the purposes I have ordained. Everything under heaven is mine. I owe no one an explanation. I answer to no authority but my own. It was not the answer Jobab had wanted. It did not explain why his children had died, why he had been afflicted with disease, why the innocent suffered while the wicked prospered. It did not make sense of the chaos, did not provide the neat moral framework his friends had offered, did not give him the courtroom confrontation he had imagined where he could present his case and be vindicated. But somehow, impossibly, it was enough. As Jobab lay prostrate in the dust, buffeted by the storm wind, hearing the voice of ultimate authority speaking from the whirlwind, something shifted inside him. It was not that his questions were answered, but that they ceased to matter in quite the same way. In the presence of this overwhelming majesty, in the face of this incomprehensible power and wisdom, his demands for explanation seemed suddenly small. He had wanted to understand, but perhaps understanding was not what he truly needed. Perhaps what he needed was simply this: to know that God was there, that God was engaged, that the universe was not chaos but cosmos, not random but governed, even if the governing followed principles beyond human comprehension. The voice fell silent. The storm began to subside. The wind dropped to a whisper. The thunder faded to distant rumbling. The clouds started to break apart. And in that silence, Jobab finally found words. Not many, but enough. He pushed himself to his knees, then managed to stand, though his body screamed with pain. He lifted his ravaged face toward heaven, toward the place where the voice had spoken, and he opened his mouth. "I know that you can do all things," he said, his voice raw but steady, "and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, 'Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge?' Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know." He paused, gathering strength, gathering words for what he needed to say. Around him, his 3 friends and young Elihu stood frozen, witnesses to this unprecedented moment. "You said, 'Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me,'" Jobab continued. "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." It was surrender, but not defeat. It was humility, but not humiliation. Jobab was acknowledging that he had spoken out of ignorance, that he had questioned what he could not understand, that his perspective had been too small, too limited, too bounded by his own experience and pain to grasp the larger patterns of divine purpose. But more than that, he was acknowledging a fundamental shift in his relationship with God. Before, his knowledge of God had been second-hand. "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear." It had been tradition, teaching, inherited faith. It had been real, but it had been mediated through others. Now, after passing through the fire of suffering, after being stripped of everything, after sitting in ashes and questioning and arguing and maintaining his integrity through it all, after finally hearing God speak from the whirlwind, now his knowledge was direct. "Now my eye sees you." He had met God face to face, not as he had imagined it would be in a courtroom with arguments and counter-arguments, but in an encounter that transcended all categories, that shattered all frameworks, that left him undone and remade simultaneously. The repentance he spoke of was not repentance for the sin his friends had accused him of. He had committed no such sin, and God would soon make that clear. It was repentance for his limited vision, for thinking he could comprehend the incomprehensible, for demanding that divine justice operate according to human understanding. It was the repentance of the finite before the infinite, the temporal before the eternal, the creature before the Creator. As Jobab finished speaking, something remarkable happened. The sky, which had been dark with storm clouds, suddenly broke open. Shafts of sunlight pierced through, illuminating the ash heap in golden light. The air, which had been heavy and oppressive, became fresh and clean, and in that moment Jobab felt something he had not felt in months: hope. Then God spoke again, but this time not to Jobab. His words were directed at the three friends who had spent so long accusing Jobab of hidden sin. "My anger burns against you, Eliphaz, and against your two friends," the voice said, and the three men fell to their knees in terror. "For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Jobab has." The vindication was complete and unexpected. Jobab had been right all along in maintaining his innocence. His friends, so confident in their theology, so certain of their understanding of divine justice, had been wrong. They had reduced the mystery of suffering to a simple equation, had made God smaller than he was, had spoken falsely even as they thought they were defending divine honor. "Now, therefore," God continued, "take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Jobab, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Jobab shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Jobab has." The friends did as they were commanded, humbled and chastened. They brought the animals to Jobab, these men who had judged him, who had added spiritual torment to physical agony, who had been so certain of their righteousness and his guilt. And Jobab, still covered in sores, still weak from months of suffering, still grieving the loss of his children, stood and prayed for them. This was perhaps the greatest test of all, greater even than the suffering itself, to intercede for those who had wounded him, to seek God's mercy for those who had shown him none. But Jobab did it, his voice rising in prayer, asking God to forgive his friends, to accept the sacrifice, to show them the grace they had failed to show him. And as he prayed, as he focused not on his own pain but on the spiritual need of others, as he moved from being the victim to being the priest, something extraordinary began to happen. His body, which had been covered in festering boils for months, began to change. The sores started to heal, closing over and leaving healthy skin beneath. The fever that had burned in him for so long suddenly broke, leaving him weak but clear-headed. The pain, which had been his constant companion, began to fade, receding like a tide going out. It was not instantaneous, not a magical transformation, but a gradual restoration that continued over the days and weeks that followed. His strength returned. His health came back. The flesh that had been ravaged by disease renewed itself. And more than physical healing, there was an interior restoration, a peace, a settledness, a deep anchoring in something that could not be shaken because it had already withstood the worst storm possible. God restored Jobab's fortunes, not because Jobab had earned it through his suffering, not as payment for his faithfulness, but simply as an act of sovereign grace, as mysterious in its giving as the suffering had been in its taking. The flocks that had been destroyed were replaced, doubled. Where Jobab had once had 200 sheep, now he had 400. Where he had lost all his livestock, now abundance returned. Neighbors who had avoided him came back, sharing meals with him, bringing gifts, celebrating his restoration. His brothers and sisters, who had stayed away during his affliction, now gathered to his house. They ate bread with him and showed him sympathy and comfort for all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him. Each brought him a piece of silver and a golden ring, helping to rebuild what had been lost. And then, in what seemed impossible, in what went beyond all hope or expectation, Jobab's wife, Keturah, who had survived the ordeal alongside him, who had grieved with him for their lost children, who had urged him to curse God and die, but had stayed with him nonetheless, she conceived. In the months that followed, as Jobab's body healed and his fortunes were restored, new life stirred in Keturah's womb, and when the time came, she gave birth to a son. They named him Jemima, which meant dove, a symbol of peace after the storm. Then came another son, whom they named Keziah, meaning cassia, a fragrant spice sweet after bitterness, and a third son, Keren-Happuch, whose name meant horn of eye paint, beautiful and precious. God gave them 7 sons in all and 3 daughters, and the daughters were renowned throughout all the land for their beauty, their grace, their wisdom. Jobab gave them inheritance along with their brothers, an unusual act that showed how his understanding of justice and value had been transformed by his journey. The years passed, seasons turning, life flowing on in its ancient rhythms. The children grew, strong and healthy, filling the house with laughter and activity. Jobab would watch them sometimes, remembering those first children he had lost, feeling the ache of that grief that would never entirely leave him, but also grateful for these new lives, these gifts he had never expected to receive. He lived a long life. Jobab did. Very long. The scriptures say he saw his children and his children's children to 4 generations. He became a grandfather many times over, a great-grandfather, a great-great-grandfather. His household grew into almost a clan, and his wisdom became legendary throughout the region. People would come from distant places to speak with him, to hear his counsel. They would ask him about suffering, about faith, about how to maintain trust when life makes no sense. And Jobab would tell them his story, not hiding the darkness, not glossing over the pain, but also speaking of the encounter with God that had transformed everything. "I do not understand why I suffered as I did," he would say, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "God never explained it to me, never gave me the answers I demanded. But I learned something more important than explanation. I learned that God is beyond my comprehension, yet not beyond my reach. I learned that faith is not about understanding everything, but about trusting the one who does understand." He would speak the whirlwind, of the voice that had addressed him, of how small he had felt and yet how seen, how his questions had been met not with answers, but with questions of his own that revealed how little he truly understood about the workings of the universe. "Where were you," he would quote, his old eyes distant with memory, "when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding." And he would shake his head and smile. "I was nowhere. I knew nothing. I understood nothing." And in that moment of ultimate humility, I finally understood something true. Visitors would lean forward, eager to hear this truth, this secret learned through such terrible cost. I understood that the universe does not revolve around me. Jobab would say simply, that suffering is not always punishment, nor prosperity always reward. That sometimes terrible things happen to good people, and we will never know why in this life. That God's purposes are larger than our happiness, deeper than our understanding, more complex than our categories of right and wrong. He would pause, letting the words sink in. But I also understood that God is not distant, that He sees, He knows, He cares, even when we cannot see how. That faith means trusting even in darkness, believing even in silence, holding fast even when everything is taken away. Young people especially would come to him, wrestling with their own questions about suffering and justice. Jobab never gave them easy answers, never pretended that faith made everything simple. The world is not a tidy place, he would tell them. Life is not fair. Terrible things will happen that you do not deserve, and good things will happen that you did not earn. This is the nature of existence. in a creation that is good, but also broken, beautiful, but also fallen. He would look at them with eyes that had seen depths of sorrow they could not yet imagine. When those terrible things come, and they will come, you will have a choice. You can curse God and die, as my own dear wife once urged me to do in her grief. You can create elaborate explanations like my friends did, reducing the mystery to formulas. Or you can do what I finally learned to do. You can hold fast to faith even without understanding, trusting that the one who made the universe, who commands the morning and sets bounds for the sea, who knows every sparrow that falls, that he is worthy of trust even when nothing makes sense. The sun would be setting as he spoke, the same sun that had risen on that terrible day so many years ago when he lost everything. But now, surrounded by children and grandchildren, his body healthy again, his life full again, he could look back and see that somehow, mysteriously, the journey had been worth it. Not because the suffering itself had value. It had been horrible, meaningless in itself, a darkness without light. But because of what he had discovered in the darkness, that faith tested is faith deepened, that God met in the whirlwind is God known in a way impossible in comfort, that the breaking can lead to a remaking into something stronger, deeper, more real. He did not romanticize the suffering. He never said it had been good or necessary or God's perfect plan. He was too honest for such platitudes, had been through too much to accept easy explanations. The loss of his first children remained a wound that never fully healed, a grief he carried always. But he also knew that he was not the same man who had stood at the entrance of his modest dwelling all those years ago, watching the dawn and counting his blessings. That man had been good, righteous even, but his faith had been untested. His trust in God mixed with trust in the blessings God had given. When the blessings were stripped away, what remained? Now he knew the answer. God remained. Faith remained. Trust remained. Not trust that bad things would not happen, but trust that God was greater than the bad things, that love was deeper than suffering, that meaning existed even in seeming meaninglessness, that the Creator could be trusted even when the creation seemed chaotic. In his final years, Jobab would often walk up to the hills where he had once tended sheep, where the messenger had first come with news of disaster. He would stand there in the evening, watching the sun set over the land of Uz, remembering. He would think of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, his friends who had meant well but understood so little. They had all passed away now, years before, and he had made peace with them completely, understanding that they had been wrestling with the same questions he was, just from a different angle. He would think of young Elihu, whose passionate speech had preceded the theophany. Elihu had grasped something the others had not, that the question was not about Jobab's sin, but about God's sovereignty. Not about desert, but about divine purpose beyond human comprehension. He would think of Keturah, who had suffered alongside him, who had watched their children die and seen her husband reduced to a creature sitting in ashes. She had found her way back to faith too, though by a different path, and together they had rebuilt not just their household, but their trust in the goodness of God. Most of all, he would remember the whirlwind, the voice that had spoken to him, the overwhelming sense of presence that had changed everything. He had asked for an audience with God, and he had received it, though not at all as he had imagined. "Blessed be the name of the Lord," he would whisper, the same words he had spoken on that terrible day when he learned of his children's deaths. But now the words carried different weight, deeper meaning. Then they had been a declaration of faith in spite of everything. Now they were a declaration of faith because of everything, because the journey through darkness had led to light, because the descent into the valley of the shadow had led to the mountaintop of encounter, because the stripping away had revealed what could not be stripped away. The stars would come out, one by one, the same stars that had been there when God asked him, "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion?" The same stars that had watched over him through all his suffering and restoration. The same stars that would continue their courses long after he was gone, following patterns set at creation, governed by laws he could not fully understand but could trust, were ordered by wisdom beyond comprehension. And Jobab would smile, an old man smile, full of memory and gratitude, sorrow and joy mixed together in ways that could not be untangled. He had lost everything and gained it back doubled. But more than that, he had lost himself and found himself transformed. He had demanded answers and received something better than answers, an encounter. He had wanted explanation and been given revelation. He had sought justice and discovered mercy. He had required understanding and been offered trust. The religion of his youth had been about blessings and curses, righteousness and reward, sin and punishment, all very neat, very understandable, very human. The faith of his maturity was about something deeper and more mysterious, about holding fast when the neat categories broke down, about trusting when understanding failed, about loving God not for what he gave, but for who he was. As full darkness fell and the evening star appeared, Venus, the light-bringer, beautiful and constant, Jobab would make his way slowly back down the hill to his house, where lamps were being lit and the evening meal was being prepared, where children's voices called out and life continued in all its ordinary miraculous complexity. He was old now, very old, full of days, the scriptures would say. He had seen much, suffered much, learned much, and soon, perhaps very soon, he would make the journey from which there was no returning, would go to join those children he had lost so long ago, would pass beyond the veil that separates the seen from the unseen. But he was not afraid. How could he be afraid, having already stood before God, having already heard the voice from the whirlwind, having already been stripped to nothing and found that nothing was not empty but full, full of presence, full of meaning, full of love that would not let him go? The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. He would murmur to himself as he walked, the ancient words that had become his anchor and his song. Blessed be the name of the Lord, blessed indeed. Through gift and loss, through prosperity and poverty, through health and sickness, through life and death, blessed be the name of the Lord. Not because everything made sense, not because all questions had been answered, not because suffering had been explained away, or evil had been defeated, or justice had been perfectly served, but because God was God, because the universe had an author, because the story had a storyteller, even if the plot twisted in ways no human writer would have chosen, because at the center of everything, holding it all together, making meaning possible even in meaninglessness, was a love beyond comprehension, a wisdom beyond questioning, a presence beyond grasping. Jobab reached his house as the last light faded from the western sky. Inside, his family waited. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a whole tribe descended from him. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now echoed with life, with voices, with laughter, with the beautiful noise of human existence continuing generation after generation. He paused at the threshold, as he had paused so many years ago on that morning when everything had still been whole. The doorway was the same, worn stone, familiar cracks in the wood. The mezuzah his grandfather had placed there still fastened to the frame. But the man who crossed it now was not the same man who had stood here in innocence, counting blessings he had thought were permanent. Inside, the oil lamps flickered warmly, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed both joy and desolation, death and rebirth. The room smelled of bread baking, of olive oil and herbs, of life continuing in its ancient patterns. Keturah looked up from where she was kneading dough, her hands white with flour, and their eyes met across the years and the suffering and the restoration. No words were needed. They had long ago learned that the deepest things could not be spoken, only shared in silence. She smiled, not the carefree smile of youth, but something richer, deeper, earned through surviving what should have destroyed them. He smiled back, and in that exchange was contained the entire journey. The loss, the grief, the questions, the whirlwind, the answer that was not an answer, the restoration that was more than restoration. The children, these new children, these gifts of grace, came running. Little Jemima, whose name meant dove, wrapped her arms around his legs. Keziah, Cassia, brought him water without being asked, her young face serious with the desire to serve. Karen Hapush, the youngest girl, horn of eye paint, beautiful even as a child, simply stood and gazed at him with those enormous eyes that seemed to see more than a child should see. And the boys, 7 sons, as there had been 7 sons before, though these were not replacements, could never be replacements. Each one unique, each one precious, each one a reminder that life persists, that creation continues, that hope is not foolish even when it has been shattered and must be rebuilt piece by careful piece. Jobab lowered himself to the floor, his body tired from the walk, but no longer ravaged by disease, no longer bent by pain. The children gathered around him as they always did in the evening, hungry not for bread, but for stories, for the wisdom that flowed from him like water from a deep well. "Tell us again, Abba," Jemima said, her voice soft as her namesake, gentle as a dove's call. "Tell us about the whirlwind." And so he did, as he had done countless times before, as he would do countless times again. But each telling was different. Each time he discovered new layers of meaning, new facets of the truth that had been revealed to him in that storm so long ago. "There was a time," he began, and the familiar words settled over the room like a blessing, "when I thought I understood how the world worked. I believed that righteousness brought blessing and sin brought suffering, that the universe operated according to rules I could comprehend, that if I lived well and honored God, I would be protected from calamity." The children listened, their faces wrapped in the lamplight. Even the oldest boys, who had heard this story many times, leaned forward. There was something in the way their father told it that made it new each time, something in his voice that carried the weight of lived experience, of truth tested in fire and found genuine. "But then," Jobab continued, his voice dropping lower, "everything was taken away. My wealth, my health, my place in the community, and worst of all," his voice caught slightly, as it always did at this part, "my children, your older brothers and sister, who came before you, who I loved with all my heart. They were taken in a single day, swept away by wind and falling stone, gone before I could say goodbye." Keturah had stopped her work and was standing still, listening. She had lived this story too, had her own version of it, her own scars and her own healing. Sometimes, when Jobab told the story, She would add her perspective, speaking of what it had been like to watch her husband reduced to sitting in ashes, to feel her own faith shaken to its foundations. "I sat in the ash heap," Jobab said, "covered in sores, burning with fever, abandoned by everyone except my dear wife and a few friends who came to mourn with me. And those friends, they meant well, they truly did, but they could not understand. They insisted that I must have sinned, that God was punishing me, that if I would only confess and repent, everything would be restored." Keziah's brow furrowed. "But you hadn't sinned, Abba. You've always been righteous." Jobab smiled at her, touched by her faith in him, knowing it was both true and incomplete. "I was not perfect, my daughter. No human is perfect. But you are right that I had not committed any sin worthy of such punishment, and that was precisely what tormented me. If I had not earned this suffering, then what did it mean? Was the universe simply chaos? Was God unjust? Did righteousness matter at all?" He paused, remembering those dark days, the questions that had circled endlessly in his fevered mind. Even now, years later, with everything restored, he could still touch that darkness, could still remember what it felt like to sit in ashes and wonder if God had forgotten him. "I demanded answers," he continued. "I wanted to stand before God and present my case, to argue my innocence, to understand why this had happened. I was angry, not at God exactly, for I could not bring myself to curse the Holy One, but angry at the situation, at the unfairness, at the mystery of it all." The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the night deepened, and the stars came out one by one. The same stars that had watched over Jobab during his suffering, the same stars that would continue their courses long after everyone in this room had returned to dust. "And then," Jobab said, his voice growing quieter, more reverent, "God answered, not with explanations, not with apologies, not with the kind of answer I had expected or wanted, but from a whirlwind. From the heart of the storm, the voice of the Almighty spoke." Even though the children had heard this part before, they held their breath. There was something awesome in the telling, something that made the hair stand up on their arms, something that connected them to that moment when their father had encountered the living God. "He asked me questions," Jobab said. "Where was I when the foundations of the earth were laid? Could I command the morning or cause the dawn to know its place? Had I entered the storehouses of the snow or seen the gates of death? Could I bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion?" His oldest son, nearly a man now, spoke up. "And what did you answer, father?" Jobab shook his head slowly. "I could not answer. That was the point. The questions were not meant to be answered, but to reveal, to show me how small my understanding was, how limited my perspective, how presumptuous my demands for explanation. I was a man trying to comprehend the infinite, a creature questioning the Creator, a finite mind attempting to grasp eternal purposes." He looked around at his children, at their young faces illuminated by firelight, and he wanted them to understand this, to carry it with them through whatever trials they would face in their own lives. "God showed me Behemoth and Leviathan," he said, "creatures of immense power that I could never hope to control or even comprehend. He showed me the vastness of creation, the complexity of the natural order, the mystery woven into every aspect of existence. And through all of this, he was saying, I made this world. I govern it. My purposes are beyond your understanding, but they are purposes nonetheless. The universe is not chaos, even when it seems chaotic to you." Jemima reached out and touched her father's hand. "Were you still sad, Abba, after God spoke to you?" It was a child's question, simple, and direct, cutting through theology to the human heart of the matter. Jobab considered it carefully, wanting to be truthful. "Yes," he said finally, "I was still sad. The grief of losing your brothers and sister never entirely left me. Even now, with all of you whom I love beyond measure, there is a place in my heart that aches for them. But the sadness was different after God spoke. It was no longer a sadness mixed with bitterness and confusion. It was simply grief, clean, pure grief for those I had lost, without the added torment of thinking it was all meaningless or unjust." Keturah came and sat beside him, adding her flour-dusted hand to the pile of hands resting together in the lamplight. "Your father learned something in that whirlwind," she said softly. "He learned that we do not love God because He gives us things. We love Him because He is God, and that changes everything." Jobab nodded, grateful for her wisdom, for the way she could take his lengthy explanations and distill them to their essence. "That is exactly right," he said. "Before my trials, my faith was mixed with self-interest. I served God, yes, but partly because serving God had brought me blessing. When the blessings were taken away, I had to discover whether my faith could stand on its own, without props, without rewards, without even understanding." The youngest boy yawned, his head drooping toward his father's shoulder. It was late, and the story, though never quite finished, never quite complete, had reached a natural resting place for tonight. "Come," Jobab said, gathering the sleepy children. "It is time for rest. Morning will come early, and there is work to do. The sheep need tending. The fields need attention. Life continues in its beautiful, ordinary way." He helped settle the children on their sleeping mats, speaking a blessing over each one, his hand resting briefly on each head. "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May He lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace." The ancient words, spoken by fathers over children since the time of Aaron, since the days when the people first came out of Egypt into the wilderness. Words that connected this small family to the great story of God and His people, words that had been spoken in times of prosperity and times of trial, words that endured because they carried truth deeper than circumstance. When the children were settled and their breathing had grown slow and regular with approaching sleep, Jobab stepped outside into the cool night air. Keturah joined him, and they stood together in the darkness, looking up at the stars. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. It was a question she had asked before, at various times over the years, and his answer was always the same. "Regret what? The suffering? Of course. I would never choose to go through that again, never wish it on anyone. But regret the journey as a whole? No, because it led me to know God in a way I never could have known Him otherwise. Before, I knew about God. After the whirlwind, I knew God. They stood in comfortable silence, husband and wife, partners in suffering and restoration. Two people who had been broken and made whole again, though the scars remained and would always remain. The hard part," Jobab said after a while, "is helping others understand. When people come to me with their suffering, seeking answers, I want so badly to give them the neat explanations my friends tried to give me. I want to tell them why they are suffering, to make sense of it, to tie it up in a package with a bow." "But you don't," Keturah said. It was not a question. "No, because I learned that suffering is not a puzzle to be solved, but a mystery to be endured. And the only thing I can offer them is what was offered to me, not answers, but presence. Not explanations, but solidarity. Not solutions, but the assurance that they are not alone, that others have walked this path before them, that faith can survive even when everything else is stripped away. A shooting star streaked across the sky, brilliant and brief. Jobab watched it fade, thinking of the brevity of human life, how quickly it passes, how precious each moment is because of its very transience. "Tomorrow," he said, "Eliphaz's grandson is coming to speak with me. He is struggling with doubt, questioning whether God truly cares about human affairs." Keturah smiled in the darkness. "And what will you tell him?" "I will tell him my story. I will tell him about sitting in ashes and demanding answers. I will tell him about the whirlwind and the questions that revealed my ignorance. I will tell him that doubt is not the opposite of faith, but often its companion. That honest questioning is not rebellion, but a search for deeper truth." He paused, remembering the young man's face when he had come to arrange this meeting, the mixture of hope and skepticism, the hunger for something real beneath the inherited beliefs and traditional formulas. "And I will tell him that the universe is not required to make sense to us, that God is under no obligation to explain himself, that sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is simply to hold on, to trust without understanding, to believe even in the darkness that there is light, even if we cannot see it." The night deepened around them. In the sheepfold, the animals stirred and settled. In the house behind them, their children dreamed whatever dreams children dream, safe and warm and loved. The world turned on its axis, following laws laid down at creation, and morning would come as it always came, reliable as breathing, certain as dawn. "I should sleep," Jobab said finally. "These old bones tire more easily than they used to." "Old?" Keturah teased gently. "You still have decades ahead of you if the Lord wills it. 4 generations to see," the promise said. "And I will be grateful for each day," Jobab replied. "That is perhaps the greatest gift the suffering gave me, the ability to be genuinely grateful for ordinary blessings. A cup of water, a piece of bread, the warmth of the sun, the love of family. These things that I once took for granted, I now receive as miracles." They went inside together, banking the fire for the night, checking once more on the sleeping children, preparing for rest. As Jobab lay down on his mat, his body relaxing into sleep, his last conscious thoughts were not of the suffering he had endured, or even of the restoration he had received, but of the voice from the whirlwind, the questions that had no answers, the mystery that was somehow more comforting than any explanation could have been. "Where were you," he whispered into the darkness, "when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And he smiled, because now he knew that he had been nowhere, had known nothing, had understood nothing, and that this was exactly as it should be. Sleep came gently, peacefully, carrying him into dreams where he walked again in green pastures and beside still waters, where his soul was restored, where goodness and mercy followed him all the days of his life. And in the morning he would wake and begin again, tending sheep, teaching children, offering wisdom to those who sought it, living out the truth he had learned through fire and wind and darkness and light. The years flowed like water, each season giving way to the next in the eternal rhythm of creation. Spring brought new lambs and the first tender shoots of barley. Summer ripened the grain and brought the sheep to higher pastures. Autumn was harvest time, when the community gathered to bring in the crops and celebrate the bounty of the earth. Winter brought cold rains and long nights by the fire, when stories were told and wisdom was passed from generation to generation. Through it all, Jobab lived his restored life with a consciousness that never quite faded, a awareness that everything he had was gift, not guarantee. He worked his fields and tended his flocks with the same dedication as before. But now, each task was also a meditation, each moment an opportunity to remember and be grateful. His reputation grew not just in Uz, but in the surrounding regions. People spoke of him as they might speak of a prophet or a sage, the man who argued with God and lived to tell the tale, some said. Others called him the one who was tested and found faithful. But Jobab himself rejected such titles, uncomfortable with anything that might suggest he was special or different from any other person seeking to live rightly. "I am simply a man who suffered and survived," he would say when people tried to elevate him. "Nothing more, nothing less. What happened to me could happen to anyone. The question is not whether trials will come. They will. But how we will respond when they do." His children grew strong and wise under his teaching. The daughters became known throughout the land, not just for their beauty, which was considerable, but for their wisdom and grace. They could discuss scripture with the rabbis, manage household affairs with skill, and showed such insight into human nature that people sought their counsel on matters both practical and spiritual. The fact that Jobab had given them an inheritance alongside their brothers was initially scandalous in a culture where such things were not done, but he had been unmoved by criticism, remembering perhaps how much his own understanding of justice and value had been expanded by his encounter with God. "My daughters are as much my children as my sons," he said simply. "They bear the image of God as surely as their brothers do. They have minds to think, and hearts to love, and souls to nurture. Why should they not share in the family inheritance?" It was a radical idea for the time, but Jobab had learned in the whirlwind that God's ways were often more expansive than human tradition, that the divine order sometimes challenged rather than confirmed conventional wisdom. His sons grew into men of integrity, each one carrying forward something of their father's character. The oldest became a respected judge, known for his fairness and his refusal to be swayed by bribes or social pressure. The second became a skilled shepherd, expanding the family flocks and developing new techniques for animal husbandry that others came to learn. The third became a scribe, dedicating himself to the careful copying and teaching of sacred texts. Each of the seven found his own path, but all carried with them the lessons their father had taught about humility before God, about the limits of human understanding, about the importance of maintaining integrity even when no one is watching, about the mystery that lies at the heart of existence. Jobab's relationships with his old friends underwent a transformation after the divine vindication. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had been humbled by God's rebuke, forced to acknowledge that their confident explanations had been wrong, that they had spoken falsely even as they thought they were defending divine honor. In the years that followed, they became not just friends again, but something deeper, fellow seekers, companions in the quest for wisdom, men bound together by the shared experience of having their certainties shattered and rebuilt on firmer ground. "You were right to be angry with us," Eliphaz said to Jobab one evening, years after the events that had tested them all. They were old men now, sitting together in the cool of the day, watching the sun set over the hills of Uz. Jobab shook his head. "I was not angry, my friend. Hurt, yes, frustrated that you could not see what seemed so clear to me, but not angry. You were doing the best you could with the understanding you had. We all were." "Still," Bildad said, his voice carrying the weight of years of reflection, "we added to your suffering. when we should have simply sat with you in silence. We were so certain we had the answers, so convinced that our theology was correct, that we could not hear what you were actually saying. And what was I saying? Jobab asked, genuinely curious how his friends now understood those painful conversations. Zophar answered, his words careful and considered. You are saying that the world is more complex than our formulas allow, that suffering is not always punishment, and prosperity is not always reward, that God is free to act in ways that confound our expectations and categories. That mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accepted. Jobab nodded slowly. Yes, exactly, and I could not have articulated it so clearly then. I only knew that your explanations did not fit my experience, that your certainty about my guilt rang false against my knowledge of my own heart. They sat in companionable silence for a while, these old friends who had been through fire together and emerged tempered, changed, deepened. Tell me, Eliphaz said eventually, do you understand now why it happened? Has time given you insight into the purpose of your suffering? It was the question people still ask Jobab, the one everyone wanted answered. Surely, after all these years, with the benefit of hindsight and restoration, he must have figured it out. Surely he could explain why he had been chosen for such testing, what divine purpose it had served, what lesson he had been meant to learn. But Jobab's answer was the same as it had always been. No, he said simply, I do not know why. God never told me, and I have stopped asking. The three friends looked at him in surprise. Stopped asking? But surely what? Jobab interrupted gently. Surely I am entitled to an explanation. Surely God owes me an accounting of his purposes. That is exactly the attitude I had to learn to release. The assumption that I had a right to understand, that divine providence should operate according to principles I could grasp. He gestured toward the sunset, the sky painted in shades of rose and gold and purple that defied description. Look at that. Can you explain why those particular colors appear at this time of day? Can you account for every interaction of light and air and dust that creates such beauty? You could perhaps offer scientific explanations, describe the physics of refraction and scattering, but would that really explain the beauty itself? Would it account for why this sight moves our hearts? His friends considered this, watching the sun slip lower toward the horizon. There are mysteries woven into the fabric of creation, Jobab continued, things that exist not to be explained, but to be experienced, to be wondered at, to draw us into deeper awe and humility. My suffering was like that sunset, something that happened, that was real, that had profound effects, but whose ultimate purpose and meaning are known only to God. But surely, Bildad pressed, there must have been some reason. Surely it was not arbitrary. Oh, I believe it had purpose, Jobab assured him. Purpose beyond my comprehension, perhaps, but purpose nonetheless. The universe is not chaos. God is not capricious. But the purpose does not have to be explicable to me for it to be real. That was the lesson of the whirlwind, that God's purposes operate on a scale and according to principles that far exceed my ability to understand. Zophar frowned, still struggling with this idea. His was a mind that craved order and explanation, that wanted everything to fit into neat categories. Then how do you live with not knowing? How do you make peace with such profound uncertainty? Jobab smiled, the smile of a man who had asked these same questions and found his way to a kind of answer, even if it was not the answer he had initially sought. I live with it, the same way I live with all the other mysteries, he said. The mystery of existence itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? The mystery of consciousness. How does mere matter, become aware of itself. The mystery of love. Why does my heart swell when I look at my grandchildren? I do not understand these things, but I do not need to understand them to experience them, to be grateful for them, to let them shape my life. He paused, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, the sky continuing to glow with reflected light even after the source had vanished. What I learned, he continued, is that faith is not about having all the answers. It is about trusting the one who does have the answers, even when he chooses not to share them with us. It is about believing that there is meaning and purpose even when we cannot see it, that there is order even in apparent chaos, that there is love even in the midst of suffering. The evening star appeared, Venus bright against the darkening sky. Jobab pointed to it. Every night that star appears, reliable, constant, beautiful. But do you know why it is there? Do you understand the mechanics of planetary motion, the nature of light, the vastness of space? No? And yet you trust that tomorrow night it will be there again, that the order you have observed will continue. He looked at his friends, his voice gentle but firm. That is faith, not blind faith. You have evidence of the pattern. You have observed the regularity. But faith nonetheless, because you cannot prove that tomorrow will be like today, cannot guarantee that the order will hold. You simply trust that it will based on what you have seen and experienced. Eliphaz nodded slowly, beginning to understand. And your experience of God's faithfulness, even through suffering, even through unanswered questions, gives you that same kind of trust. Exactly, Jobab confirmed. I do not need to understand why I suffered in order to trust that God is good. I do not need to know the purpose in order to believe there is purpose. My experience, both in the suffering and in the restoration, but especially in the encounter with God from the whirlwind, has shown me that God is worthy of trust even when I do not understand. The night deepened around them, and stars began to appear in multitudes, a field of light scattered across the darkness. Each one, Jobab knew, was a sun perhaps, with its own worlds and wonders, vast beyond imagining. The universe was larger than human minds could grasp, more complex than human theories could encompass, more mysterious than human wisdom could penetrate. And that was not a problem. That was the truth. And accepting that truth, truly accepting it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, in the depths of the soul, that was what the whirlwind had taught him. I should return home, Eliphaz said eventually, rising stiffly. His old joints protested the movement, reminding him of his own mortality, his own finitude. My wife will wonder where I have wandered off to. The others rose as well, and they embraced before parting these old friends who had been through so much together. They would meet again. They met often, finding comfort and challenge in each other's company, iron sharpening iron, as the proverb said. But for tonight, the conversation was complete. Another layer of understanding added to the accumulation of years. Jobab walked home slowly, in no hurry, enjoying the cool night air, the sound of his sandals on the stone path, the distant bleating of sheep, settling for the night. These simple sensations, these ordinary moments, they were precious to him in a way they had not been before his testing. He had learned not to take them for granted, to receive each one as the gift it was. At home, his household was preparing for sleep. His children, though many were adults now with children of their own, still lived nearby, still gathered frequently at their father's house. It had become a kind of hub, a place where the extended family converged to share meals, celebrate festivals, seek counsel, or simply enjoy each other's company. Tonight, several of his grandchildren were staying over, and Jobab found them already settled on their sleeping mats, waiting for him. They knew the routine. Grandfather would come, would speak a blessing over them, and if they were very good and very lucky, might tell them a story before sleep claimed them. "Grandfather," the youngest girl cried when she saw him, "tell us about the animals God showed you." Jobab laughed, settling himself among them, his old bones grateful for the chance to rest. "Ah, you want to hear about Behemoth and Leviathan again?" "Yes," the children chorused, their eyes bright with anticipation. They never tired of this story, of the description of creatures so powerful that no human could hope to tame them, monsters from the deep and the wild places, symbols of the untamed forces of creation. "Very well," Jobab said, his voice dropping into the storytelling cadence that he had perfected over years of practice. "Picture in your mind a creature so large that when it eats grass, it clears a field in a day. Its legs are like cedar trees, its bones like bars of bronze. Its tail stiffens like a mitre cedar, and its muscles are like knots of iron." The children listened, rapt, as their grandfather painted word pictures of beasts beyond imagining. He described how Behemoth moved through the marshes, how the lotus plants concealed it in the shade, how it drank from the river without fear. "And Leviathan," he continued, his voice taking on a note of awe that was genuine, for even after all these years, the memory of God's description could still fill him with wonder. "A creature of the deep, covered in scales so tightly fitted together that no air can pass between them. When it rises from the water, terror dances before it. When it breathes, smoke pours from its nostrils like a boiling pot. Its breath kindles coals and flames come from its mouth." One of the boys shivered deliciously. "Is it real, Grandfather? Did you see it?" "I did not see it with my eyes," Jobab clarified. "God described it to me, painted the picture with words so vivid that I could imagine it perfectly. Whether it was a real creature or a symbol, I cannot say. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. What matters is what it represented." "And what was that?" the girl asked, though she had heard this explanation many times before. "It represented the wild, untamable forces of creation," Jobab said. "The parts of the world that do not bend to human will, that cannot be domesticated or controlled. God was showing me that He had created things far beyond my ability to manage or even comprehend. If I could not tame Leviathan, how could I presume to understand or question God's governance of the universe?" He looked around at the circle of young faces, wanting them to grasp this truth while they were still young, before life had a chance to convince them otherwise. "You will meet your own Leviathans in life," he told them seriously. "Situations you cannot control, problems you cannot solve, questions you cannot answer, forces that are simply too large, too powerful, too complex for you to manage. And when that happens, you will have a choice." "What choice?" one of the older boys asked. "You can rage against them, exhaust yourself trying to tame what cannot be tamed, or you can acknowledge your limits, accept that some things are beyond your power, and trust that the one who made Leviathan is also the one who governs it, who sets bounds for it, who ensures that it serves purposes you may never understand, but which are purposes nonetheless." The children pondered this, each according to their capacity. The youngest might not fully grasp it yet, but the seeds were being planted, the foundation laid, when their own trials came, and they would come as surely as dawn follows darkness. They would have these stories, these lessons, this inheritance of tested faith to draw upon. "Now," Jobab said, his voice gentling further, becoming the soft murmur that would guide them toward sleep. It is time to rest. The night is deep, and morning will come early. Close your eyes and breathe slowly. Remember that the same God who made Behemoth and Leviathan, who commands the morning and sets bounds for the sea, is watching over you as you sleep. He began to speak the ancient bedtime prayer, his voice rhythmic and soothing. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, God of truth. I will both lie down in peace and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. The words flowed over the children like a warm blanket, like gentle waves lapping at the shore, like the soft breath of wind through olive trees. One by one, their eyes closed, their breathing deepened, and sleep claimed them. Jobab sat with them a little longer, watching them rest, these precious young lives entrusted to the next generation's care. His own children were raising them well, passing on the faith, teaching them the stories and the lessons and the prayers. The chain continued, link by link, generation by generation, from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, through the centuries and the exiles and the returns, through slavery in Egypt and wandering in wilderness and settlement in the promised land. And now, here, in this small house in Uz, his own small part of that great story was being lived and passed on. It was humbling and awesome simultaneously, this participation in something so much larger than himself. Eventually, he rose and went to his own sleeping place. Keturah was already there, waiting for him in the darkness. "The children?" she asked softly. "Sleeping like lambs in the fold," he replied, lying down beside her, dreaming whatever dreams the innocent dream. They lay in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the distant call of a night bird, the soft snores of sleeping children. "I was thinking today," Keturah said quietly, "about those first children, the ones we lost." Jobab said nothing, just reached out and found her hand in the darkness, holding it gently. It was not a subject that came up often anymore, but when it did, they had learned to simply be present to it, to allow the grief its space without trying to fix it or explain it away. "I wonder sometimes," she continued, "what they would have been like if they had lived, what kind of adults they would have become, what kind of parents, whether we would have grandchildren from them as well." "I wonder too," Jobab acknowledged. "There is no way not to wonder." "And yet," Keturah said, her voice catching slightly, "I would not trade these children we have now for anything. Is that wrong? Does that dishonor the memory of the first ones?" "No," Jobab said firmly. "No, my love. Love is not finite. The heart's capacity to love does not diminish with division, but expands with exercise. We can love these children completely while still grieving those we lost. The two do not cancel each other out." "I know," she said. "In my head I know. But sometimes my heart struggles with it." "That is because your heart is faithful," Jobab said gently. "It remembers. It honors those we have lost. That is not wrong. That is beautiful. The human heart is vast enough to hold all our loves, past and present, without diminishing any of them." She was quiet for a moment, then squeezed his hand. "You always know what to say." "Not always," he corrected gently. "But I have had many years to think about these things, to live with questions that have no easy answers. And I have learned that grief and gratitude can coexist, that sorrow and joy are not enemies, but companions in this complex journey we call life." They lay together in the comfortable darkness, two souls who had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but stronger for the scars they bore. Outside, the night continued its eternal watch, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient dance, the same stars that had witnessed creation itself that would continue long after Jobab and Keturah had returned to dust. "Sleep now," Jobab whispered. "Tomorrow brings new mercies, new opportunities to live out the truth we have learned. Rest in the knowledge that we are held, always held, by hands greater than we can imagine." Keturah's breathing gradually deepened, slipping into the peace of sleep. But Jobab remained awake a little longer, his mind drifting over the landscape of his life, seeing it now from the vantage point of age and experience as one might see a valley from a mountaintop, all of it visible at once, the valleys and peaks, the shadows and the light. He thought about the question his grandson had asked him recently. "Grandfather, if you could go back and change what happened, would you?" It was a question he had asked himself countless times over the years. Would he choose to avoid the suffering if he could? Would he trade the encounter with God from the whirlwind for the lives of his first children? Would he exchange the depth of faith he now possessed for the simpler, untested faith of his youth? The answer was complex, layered like the sedimentary rock in the hills around Uz. No, he would not wish suffering on anyone. No, he would not choose to lose his children. No, he would not willingly enter that ash heap again. The pain had been real, devastating, nearly unbearable. But he also would not trade what he had discovered in the depths. He would not give back the knowledge of God that came only through the whirlwind. He would not relinquish the peace that could survive any storm because it was anchored in something deeper than circumstance. It was a paradox he had learned to live with, the ability to hold two truths simultaneously. The suffering was terrible, and the journey was sacred. The loss was real, and the gain was profound. The questions remained unanswered, and the answer he received was sufficient. This was the mystery at the heart of faith he had come to understand. Not that everything would make sense, but that meaning existed even when sense did not. Not that pain would be avoided, but that pain could be transformed. Not that God would explain himself, but that God would be present. As sleep finally began to claim him, Jobab's last conscious thought was a prayer, simple and profound. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given us life, sustained us through darkness and light, and brought us to this moment. May your presence continue to guide us, your wisdom continue to teach us, your love continue to hold us, not because we understand, but because you are worthy of trust, not because we are perfect, but because you are faithful." Amen. The final years of Jobab's life unfolded like a slow sunset, gradual and golden, beautiful in its very passing. He became a living library of wisdom, a breathing testimony to the possibility of faith that survives the unsurvivable. People would make pilgrimages to Uz specifically to sit at his feet, to hear the story from his own lips, to ask the questions that haunted their own nights. And Jobab would receive them all, the doubters and the devout, the suffering and the curious, the young seeking wisdom and the old seeking comfort. He never turned anyone away, never grew tired of telling his story, never lost patience with the same questions asked again and again, because he understood something profound. Each person who asked was not asking the same question. They were asking their own question, shaped by their own pain, colored by their own experience, desperately seeking their own way through their own whirlwind. To the woman who had lost her husband, grief is not something to be gotten over, but something to be carried, and you will find in time that the weight becomes bearable, not because it grows lighter, but because you grow stronger in the carrying of it. To the young man angry at God, your anger is not sin, it is honesty. God can handle your rage, your questions, your accusations. What he cannot work with is pretense, the false face we put on to convince others and ourselves that we are fine when we are breaking inside. Bring him your real self, even if that self is angry, especially if that self is angry. To the elderly woman afraid of death, I have stood at the edge of that darkness, have felt its pull, have looked into its depths, and I can tell you this, it is not empty. It is not nothing. It is a doorway, a passage, a return. We came from God, and to God we return. The journey between is brief, precious, and purposeful, but it is not the end of us. To the successful merchant who felt empty despite his wealth, I had flocks and herds, servants and children, health and respect, and in a single day it was all gone. What remained? I remained. My soul remained. My capacity to choose faith or bitterness remained. And I learned that what we are is more important than what we have, that who we are becoming matters more than what we are accumulating. Each conversation was unique, tailored to the individual heart before him, but always, woven through every word, was the same thread, that life is mystery, that suffering is real but not final, that faith is possible even in darkness, that God is worthy of trust even when he does not explain himself. One autumn afternoon, when the leaves were beginning to turn and the air carried the first hint of winter's approach, Jobab sat in his favorite spot, the same hillside where he had once tended sheep, where the messenger had first brought news of disaster, where his world had shattered and eventually been remade. His great-great-grandchildren played nearby, their voices like birdsong, innocent and joyful. 4 generations. The promise had been fulfilled. He had seen children and children's children and children's children's children, and even the generation beyond that. The line continued. Life persisted. Hope renewed itself with each birth, each dawn, each season's turn. Keturah came slowly up the hill, her steps measured but steady. They were both very old now, their bodies marked by the passage of decades, but their spirits remained vibrant, alive, engaged with the mystery and beauty of existence. She sat beside him without speaking, and they watched the sun begin its descent together as they had done countless times before. There was no need for words between them anymore. They had lived a lifetime together, had survived what should have destroyed them, had rebuilt what had been broken, had learned what could only be learned through fire. It has been a good life, Keturah said finally, her voice soft but certain. Yes, Jobab agreed. A strange life, a difficult life, a mysterious life, but good, very good. Do you think, she asked, that when we die, we will understand? Will God finally explain? Jobab considered this, his ancient eyes tracking the path of a hawk riding the thermal currents overhead. Perhaps, he said slowly, or perhaps we will discover that explanation was never the point. Perhaps we will simply be enfolded in the presence we have sought all our lives, and in that enfolding, the questions will simply dissolve, not because they are answered, but because they are transcended. He paused, then added, or perhaps I am wrong about that too. I have been wrong about so much, but I am no longer afraid of being wrong. I am no longer afraid of not knowing. I have learned to rest in mystery the way a child rests in a father's arms, not because the child understands everything, but because the child trusts the one who holds them. The sun touched the horizon, setting the sky ablaze with colors that had no names, that existed for mere moments before fading into the gathering dusk. And in that fading, There was no sense of loss, only the natural rhythm of day giving way to night, of light trusting darkness, of the seen dissolving into the unseen. "When I go," Jobab said quietly, "and I think it will not be long now, I am ready, Keturah. I am not eager, for I love this life, love you, love our children, and all the generations that have come from us. But I am ready. I have made my peace with mystery. I have learned to trust in darkness as well as light. I have held fast to faith through the storm, and the storm has taught me things the calm never could." Keturah leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat that way as the stars began to emerge one by one, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast expanse of darkness. Each star a sun, perhaps, with its own worlds, its own stories, its own mysteries. The universe was so large, and they were so small, and yet they were not insignificant. Each life mattered, each soul was known, each heart was held. "The Lord gave," Jobab whispered, "the words that had become his anchor, his song, his testimony, and the Lord has taken away." And Keturah, who had lived those words alongside him, who had her own scars and her own journey, completed the verse with him, their voices blending in the darkness. "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Not because they understood everything, not because all their questions had been answered, not because the pain had been erased or the losses restored, but because through it all, through the giving and the taking, through the blessing and the suffering, through the questions and the silence, they had discovered something more valuable than explanation, more solid than certainty, more enduring than comfort. They had discovered faith, real faith, tested faith, faith that could look into the whirlwind and not be destroyed, faith that could sit in ashes and not curse, faith that could lose everything and still say, "Blessed be." And that faith, hard-won and battle-scarred, was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The night deepened around them, peaceful and vast. In the distance, lamplight flickered in the windows of homes across Uz, each one sheltering its own stories, its own struggles, its own search for meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to live out the truth they had learned. But tonight, this moment, there was simply peace, perfect, profound, unshakable peace. The peace that comes not from having all the answers, but from knowing the one who does. The peace that survives the storm because it is rooted in something deeper than circumstance. The peace that Jobab, had found in the whirlwind and carried with him ever since. As the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, as the earth turned on its axis, following laws laid down at creation, as the universe continued its mysterious unfolding according to purposes beyond human comprehension, two old souls sat together on a hillside in Uz, held in hands greater than they could imagine, loved by a love that would not let them go, sustained by a presence that neither slumbered nor slept. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. "Blessed be the name of the Lord," they whispered together one final time. The words, a prayer, a testimony, a song that would outlast them, that would be carried forward by their children and their children's children, generation after generation. An eternal reminder that faith is possible, that trust is reasonable, that even in the darkest valley, we are not alone, never alone, always held, forever loved. Rest now, dear listener. Let this story settle into your heart like seeds planted in good soil. You, too, are on a journey, walking your own path through valleys and over mountains, through darkness and into light. And like Jobab, you are not alone. You are seen. You are known. You are held. Whatever questions torment you, whatever losses you grieve, whatever trials you face, you are not alone. The same God who spoke from the whirlwind, who held Jobab through his darkest night, who restored what was broken and brought beauty from ashes, that same God walks with you now. Sleep in peace. Rest in the knowledge that your life has meaning, that your struggles have purpose, that your faith, however small, however tested, is seen and honored. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns, its own challenges, its own opportunities. But tonight, this moment, simply rest. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Release the tensions of the day, and remember, you are beloved. You are held. You are never, ever alone. Blessed be the name of the Lord, now and forever. Amen. If you found peace in this journey through faith and restoration, there is another story waiting for you, another soul to meet, another lesson to learn, another path toward the rest your spirit seeks. Click the video on your screen now to continue this sacred journey where ancient wisdom meets the deep needs of your heart. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. Together, we walk this path of faith, supporting one another, sharing the light we've been given, finding our way home to the peace that passes all understanding. Sleep well, beloved. Until we meet again in another story, another journey, another gentle exploration of faith that meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Peace be with you.